David died on a Thursday. By Friday, his sister Natalie was already measuring the drapes in our living room. At his will reading, she leaned back with a smirk, waiting for her inheritance. But when the lawyer said my name, only my name, she stopped breathing. What she didn't know was this. 3 years before his death, David rewrote everything. Every asset, every property, every stock transferred to me. Quietly, legally, irrevocably. I wasn't just the grieving widow. I was the empire's sole heir, and I had no intention of sharing it with anyone, especially not her. The evening of our 7th wedding anniversary glowed with golden candlelight and rehearsed toasts. Our home, David called it the House of Light, was filled with colleagues, cousins, board members, all orbiting around David as if he were the sun. I played the doting wife, perfectly coiffed, perfectly polite. My dress was cream silk, chosen by David himself. "Softness suits you," he had said, but my stomach had been knotted since noon. Earlier that day, while organizing a folder David left on the kitchen island, I found a document I wasn't meant to see. A property transfer agreement, one we had supposedly signed together years ago. Except my name had been spelled wrong. The signature didn't match my handwriting. I had no memory of ever seeing that version. When I brought it up casually over lunch, David smiled in that way he did when he wanted to redirect the conversation. "Let's not talk about paperwork today," he said. "Let's just celebrate us." Or, but it wasn't the document that unsettled me most. It was Natalie. She arrived at the party an hour late in a sapphire dress, flashing the kind of smile that could melt plastic. She hugged David, skipped me entirely, and within minutes was holding court with our guests in the foyer. I watched her from across the room, sipping champagne. At one point, our eyes met. She looked straight through me and then smirked. Not like someone who knew a secret, more like someone who had already won. After the last guest left and the house quieted, I wandered into the West Wing. It had always been off limits. David claimed it was just storage, forgotten relics from a life before me. But that night, the door was ajar. I hesitated, heart thudding. Inside, dust floated in streaks of moonlight. Cardboard boxes, a vintage piano, filing cabinets. One drawer was half open. I reached for the handle. 2 days later, David fell. They said it was an accident. He had tripped over his own briefcase on the landing, fell backwards down the staircase. No witnesses, no footage. Our home security system had gone offline that morning due to a firmware update. I didn't scream when the officer told me. I just sat there, staring at the red velvet rope Natalie had tied on the staircase banister during the party. It was gone now. The will reading was scheduled for the following Friday. David's lawyer, Mr. Hale, greeted me with a nod as I entered the mahogany-paneled conference room. Natalie was already seated, tapping her nails on the glass table. She wore black, of course, but her lipstick was scarlet. She didn't offer condolences, just a glance and then a dry laugh. "He never changed it, you know," she whispered. "He told me he'd always make sure I was taken care of." Mr. Hale cleared his throat. "Let's begin." I folded my hands in my lap and kept my eyes on the table as he read through the formalities. Then he paused, glanced at me, and continued. Per the living trust established 3 years prior to Mr. Carter's passing, all assets, real estate, financial accounts, intellectual property, and equity in Carter Holdings are legally and irrevocably transferred to Madison Carter, effective immediately. The silence was deafening. Natalie's nails stopped tapping. "I'm sorry," she said, leaning forward. "That can't be right. I have the previous will. He left me 25%. I'm a co-owner." Mr. Hale nodded. "That document has been superseded. The living trust was filed, notarized, and enacted under full capacity. As of now, Madison Carter is the sole beneficiary." Natalie stood up so fast her chair toppled. "He wouldn't do that. He loved me like a daughter. He said we were partners." I didn't speak. I couldn't. Not because I was shocked, but because, deep down, I had always known there was something more beneath the smiles, the parties, the rehearsed affection. And now, as she screamed, all I could think about was that open drawer, that half-read file, that room he'd kept from me for 7 years. This wasn't a gift, it was a message, and I had just inherited more than a fortune. I had inherited a war. The media didn't wait. Less than 48 hours after the will reading, my face was plastered across headlines. Black widow or blindsided wife. From lawyer to heiress, inside Madison Carter's sudden fortune. Natalie had clearly been busy. Her interviews painted me as a manipulative gold digger, a passive-aggressive social climber who seduced her way into David's legacy. I didn't respond. Not to the reporters outside my house, not to the op-eds or the podcasts dissecting my meteoric rise. I stayed inside, silent, observing, waiting. It was during one of those long, hushed nights that I remembered the safe. David had always kept it behind the bookshelf in his office, cleverly hidden behind a row of vintage tax books. I had seen him open it only once, years ago, and at the time I hadn't asked what was inside. I told myself it was none of my business. That was the old version of me, the one who thought love meant not looking too closely. Now I pulled the books away, revealing the dull steel face of the safe. I still remembered the code, our wedding date. It clicked open with a heavy sigh, as though the metal had been holding its breath for years. Inside were 3 leather folders, a flash drive, and a handwritten letter addressed to me. I opened the letter first. If you're reading this, then I've failed to control the outcome. That was the first line. He went on to explain what he called the tri-key legacy. 3 wills, each drafted under different legal parameters. One for Natalie, one for his mother, and one for me. All filed, all notarized, all legal. But only one could be real at any given time, depending on which key he activated. You were always meant to be the endgame, Em, he wrote, but I needed leverage. They would have devoured us both if I gave you everything too soon. I didn't know whether to scream or sob. Instead, I opened the folders. Each will was typed meticulously, dated differently, tailored to the recipient's ego. Natalie's version emphasized co-leadership. His mother stressed legacy preservation. Mine was short, clean, absolute. Next came the flash drive. It held a digital archive, password-protected files, spreadsheets, voice memos. I clicked on one labeled Family Fund Transfers Q3. The numbers meant little at first. Then I saw the pattern. Offshore accounts, private equity holdings under shell companies, payments to names I didn't recognize, and next to them, handwritten tags, N hold, M defer, Mom deny. This wasn't just financial planning. This was orchestration. I wasn't the accidental heir. I was the final phase. Still, it didn't feel like victory. Not yet. The next morning, I tracked down the private attorney David had used during the last 2 years of his life, a man named Charles Litton, semi-retired, living in a quiet town 2 hours away. He agreed to meet in a library. No phones, no records. He looked like I expected. Sharp suit, measured voice, eyes that had seen too many lies. David was a man who believed in layered truths, Litton said, sipping his tea. He designed the trust system like a game theory experiment. Everyone thought they had power. No one did. I laid out the 3 wills. He didn't flinch. He had me file them separately, different counties, different states, all under varying clauses. Even if challenged, they would cancel each other out, leaving only the living trust, yours, as default. And he told no one? I asked. Only me, and now you. He paused, then reached into his briefcase and handed me a key. A literal key. Small, silver, no tag. This opens a box in Zurich. He instructed me to give it to you if the trust went uncontested for more than 10 days. What's in the box? He shrugged. He never said, only that it was the real vault. The others were shadows. By the time I left, the sun had already set. I drove home with the key clenched in my hand, heart pounding. Not from fear, but realization. David had left me more than money. He had left me control. And now, with the world watching me burn, they had no idea I was standing on a stockpile of secrets, holding matches of my own. Control, I had learned, was never about ownership. It was about silence. 10 days had passed since the will reading. I received no legal challenge, no court summons. But the calm was strategic, not surrender. Natalie had gone quiet, too quiet. The tabloids shifted their attention, but I knew better. She was reloading. I returned to the files David left behind, reading more deeply, connecting dots I had missed before. One name kept surfacing: Mirror Fund. At first, I thought it was just another shell company, another layer in David's financial labyrinth. But the more I read, the more I realized this was no ordinary fund. It was built for me, or rather, it was built around me. I was listed as the legal owner, the sole trustee. On paper, it looked like a safety net, a $120 million trust designed to protect my financial future. But the fine print told a different story. The fund had an activation clause. Access required full compliance with a behavioral integrity agreement. The agreement had only one clause: do not publicly speak about the trust, its contents, or any prior legal arrangements related to David Carter or his estate. In essence, silence in exchange for solvency. If I spoke out, if I defended myself, challenged Natalie, published my story, the fund would freeze. My assets would revert to an internal holding group. The control I thought I had was conditional. The power I held was a leash. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how far back the manipulation went. Had David planned this from the beginning? Had Natalie been his accomplice or his victim? The next morning, I decided I wouldn't play by their rules, but I would make it look like I was. First, I hired a private investigator. He had the look of a washed-up sports anchor and the instincts of a predator. I told him to pose as a freelance journalist doing a redemption profile on Natalie. The angle, her side of the story, framed as a misunderstood woman wronged by the legacy of her brother. He booked a casual interview at a downtown bar. Natalie, ever hungry for validation, agreed. They drank. She talked. By drink 3, she confessed that David used her as bait, that he promised her a steak if she could keep Madison in line, that she hated me, not because I married her brother, but because I made her irrelevant. I was the fire, she slurred. She was just the mirror, but David, he made me her shadow. The investigator recorded everything. Meanwhile, I worked on another front. I needed to invalidate Natalie's lawsuit before she could file it. The Mirror Fund's silence clause applied only to public statements, not legal filings. I drafted a counterclaim of fiduciary coercion, accusing both David and Natalie of creating a psychological trap under the guise of trust law. It wasn't bulletproof, but it was loud enough to trigger scrutiny. Then, something I hadn't anticipated. My legal assistant flagged a document Natalie had submitted as preliminary evidence, an old property agreement with a notarized clause showing early asset transfer. The witness signature? My mother's. I stared at the paper for 5 minutes before I could breathe. My mother, a retired English teacher from Vermont. She had met David only a few times, always smiled, always polite. I called her. She didn't deny it. Madison, she said quietly, he told me it was a simple verification, that you were consolidating properties. He made it sound smart, responsible. When was this? 3 years ago, right after he visited your father's grave. A silence stretched between us. I remembered that week. David had insisted I stay behind, said he wanted to connect with my past alone. I had thought it was a gesture. Now I saw it for what it was, set up. He had used my mother to forge the illusion of consent. He had planned every angle, and I had walked into it willingly. But now the board was mine. I had the recordings, the documents. The key to the Zurich box still burned in my purse. But more than that, I had something they didn't count on. I had learned the rules of their game, and I was about to rewrite them. My mother didn't cry. Neither did I. We sat across from each other in her sunroom, where the light always made everything feel too honest. She had baked scones, out of habit, maybe, or guilt. I didn't touch them. She didn't try to defend herself. "He told me it was for your protection," she said, voice level. "Said your assets were being split too many ways, that you needed to simplify. He told you who he was? He told me he was your fiancé's attorney. He never gave a name. I didn't connect the dots until the will reading. And by then, it made too much sense. David had always been 10 steps ahead, even before I met him. When I was 19, I'd signed a bundle of property consolidation documents. He'd said it was for financial aid qualification. I had no idea that one of them included early authorization of trust structures, which years later would be reclassified as part of the Mirror Fund. I wasn't even legally of age in some states when I signed, and now I was the face of a system I hadn't known I was entering. It wasn't love, it was design. Still, I didn't hate him, because now I understood him. David didn't build empires, he built ecosystems, self-replicating structures that could survive without him. But he forgot one thing. No system accounts for a person learning. I had learned. That evening, I stood before a private arbitration panel and filed suit, not against Natalie for defamation or breach, but under a rarely used clause in fiduciary trust law, malicious faith inheritance manipulation. My claim was radical, that Natalie had knowingly used inherited legal documents to consolidate emotional loyalty from board members, donors, and shareholders, weaponizing family legacy to dominate a financial network. "I'm not suing for money," I told the panel. "I'm suing to dismantle a method." The lawsuit went public in hours. The following morning, I dropped the bomb. From a remote location, I uploaded the entire archive of the Mirror Fund, transaction trails, emotional manipulation patterns, multiple D.I. Chook drafts, voice memos between David and Natalie, flagged psychological profiles of potential threats, including one labeled Madison C? The investors panicked. Within 24 hours, 23% of the fund's stakeholders pulled out. A major tech donor demanded a forensic audit. An independent review board was established. Natalie issued a statement calling the archive doctored and defamatory. But by then, it was too late. The story had changed. The headlines flipped. From gold-digging widow to the silent architect. I didn't give interviews. I didn't post on social media. I let the documents speak, and they spoke loudly. Natalie was summoned to a federal hearing over financial misrepresentation, specifically tied to her attempt to replace the original trust document with an altered version. But in the courtroom, something unexpected happened. Under pressure, she cracked. Natalie admitted under oath that she had accessed David's private files after his death and swapped one of the printed copies of the trust with a modified version, hoping to reassert herself as a co-beneficiary. She said she panicked. She said she thought he'd meant to change it back. But the twist came from the judge. "In altering a pre-executed trust," the judge said, "you've invalidated your own standing. Ironically, your tampering confirms the original document's authenticity." Natalie froze. The realization sank in slowly. Her desperation had accidentally validated my inheritance. The courtroom buzzed. Outside, the cameras waited. Inside, I stayed still. The final blow came later that evening, when I was alone in my office. I was reviewing footage from Zurich, my recent visit to the vault David left me access to. The box contained an old pocket watch, a flash drive, and a handwritten note that simply read, "You're ready." The flash drive held nothing but passwords to encrypted accounts. Clean accounts, no traps, no dead man clauses. I thought that was the end. Until my phone lit up. A new message from a contact that no longer existed. David C. "Madison, we need to talk." I stared at the screen. No number, just a name. I opened the message. It was empty. But the typing bubble appeared. He was still alive, somewhere, watching. The next morning, I met with an agent from the Department of Financial Intelligence. He didn't wear a badge, didn't introduce himself with a title, just offered me coffee and said my name with uncomfortable precision. "We know David Carter didn't die," he said. I didn't flinch. He continued, "He's been part of a federal witness protection program for the past 4 years. The accident? Staged. He testified against a multinational trust laundering operation in Europe. We kept him alive, out of necessity. So why are you telling me now? Because you control what happens next." There it was, the choice. If I revealed David's survival, every asset I inherited from the trust would be frozen under federal authority. Money laundering investigations, international subpoenas, years of audits. If I stayed silent, I'd live in shadow, knowing the man who orchestrated my life was still out there, unpunished, possibly still playing the game. They gave me 3 days to decide. I didn't go home. I drove for hours and ended up in a small, unfamiliar town where no one knew my name. I checked into a nameless motel with scratchy sheets and silence and let myself think freely for the first time in months. David wasn't dead. He had orchestrated every layer of our relationship since I was 19. The trust, the documents, my mother's signature, Natalie's manipulation, the Zurich vault. All of it was curated, not spontaneous. And it was never about love. It was about leverage. He once told me that power was only dangerous when you think you own it. Real power, he said, is having it and choosing not to use it. But I didn't want power anymore. I wanted autonomy. On the final day of my decision window, I returned to the city and walked straight into the office of a publishing house. I had no manuscript, no proposal, just a title written on a notepad. Inheritance isn't ownership. I offered them a one-time exclusive, not a memoir, a disclosure. A story told by someone who inherited everything and chose to burn it. They hesitated until I showed them my name. Then they listened. The book was published 2 months later. I made no money from it. All proceeds were redirected to a fund I quietly registered. The Madison Ledger Project, an open access database of real estate contracts, trust abuse cases, financial grooming patterns, and whistleblower protections. The fund exploded. Within 6 weeks, I was invited to speak at a global financial ethics summit. I stood on stage in a black pantsuit, minimalist, no makeup, no PR team, just me and a microphone. I didn't talk about David by name. I told the audience about a woman who had once signed her autonomy away at 19, who had been made to believe she was the chosen one, when in fact she was just another player on a chessboard built by men who wore charm like armor. "I didn't lose everything," I said. "I gave it back." The applause was respectful. Nothing dramatic, but something shifted. I felt it. Later that night, during the Q&A portion, a hand went up from the back of the room. A girl, maybe 20, dark eyes, freckled cheeks, no press badge, just presence. She waited for the mic and then, in a voice that didn't shake, said, "Madison, I think you knew my father." The air changed. She continued, "My name is Eva. My mother's name was Lucia Carter. She died last year. I found letters addressed to David and a picture of you. I think I'm his daughter, and I think he used you too. I want to know the truth. I want to know why he left us and why he gave you everything." The room was silent. I met her eyes. There was no malice, just a mirror. I saw myself at 19 again, holding a pen I didn't understand, and I understood in that moment that the game hadn't ended. It had only changed players. I didn't answer her question. Instead, I stepped off the stage, walked slowly down the center aisle, and placed something in her hand. A key. Simple. Silver. Engraved with the number 27. She looked at it, confused. I leaned close and whispered, "Vault 27, in Bern. Ask for the Roth room. Everything you're looking for is there. Not just about David. about all of them. She blinked and I saw it. The moment a story transfers ownership. She didn't nod. She didn't cry. She just closed her hand around the key like it meant something more than access. Like it meant permission. And then I walked away. I didn't stay for the rest of the summit. I didn't read the headlines the next day. I didn't respond to interview requests or invitations to advisory boards. Instead, I packed a small bag, turned off my phone, and drove north until the air felt different. The town hadn't changed much. The law school still stood at the edge of the lake, humble and unassuming. I rented a one-bedroom cabin nearby, the same model students used for retreat weekends. No one recognized me. No one cared to. That was the point. I began teaching in small groups. No accreditation, no tuition, just open sessions under a chalkboard nailed to a shed wall. We called it the Rewrite Circle. The women who came weren't students in the traditional sense. They were daughters of men who had made wealth into shackles, wives who had signed contracts without reading, sisters of brothers who believed inheritance was identity. We studied case law, yes, but more than that, we studied strategy. We rewrote the fine print. We broke down the architecture of control that lived inside clauses and conditions. We dissected language like it was anatomy, and we told our stories. The first time one of them cried, it wasn't because she'd been betrayed. It was because she finally had the words to name it. I realized then that justice isn't about revenge or restitution. It's about translation, giving shape to harm so it can't hide. Months passed. Winter arrived gently. I found myself waking to the sound of snow against the roof and the smell of paper and ink. I kept no staff. I made my own tea. I walked the trails behind the cabin until I could feel my heartbeat without panic. Vault 27 was never mentioned in the news, but I knew she had gone. Ava. I knew because one day a package arrived at the cabin. No return address. Just a photograph inside. The entrance to the Roth room, and behind it, a notebook, handwritten. Its first page read, "The Daughter's Ledger." The system David built had always assumed silence. Now it had voices. I never saw Eva again. I didn't need to. Somewhere out there, a girl was rewriting the rules. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to monitor the outcome. The day I knew I was done came unexpectedly. A former student of mine, Elena, stood up during a rewrite session and asked, "What would you do differently if no one ever gave you anything?" I paused. Then I said, "I would have built it anyway, but I would have built it with better exits." That night, I sat alone at my desk and wrote one final document. Not a will, not a trust, not a deed. It was an exit clause. Not from life, but from legacy. It stated that all work I'd created under the Madison Ledger Project was now open source. No board, no successor, no seal, just stories. The last line I wrote in ink instead of digital text was this: I don't own anything anymore, but for the first time in my life, I control myself. I folded the paper, placed it inside a fireproof envelope, and sealed it. Then I stepped outside, into the soft night, and let the wind carry the rest of the past away.